I'm an architect in Boston.
Yeah.
David Lee, Stellan Lee Architects here in Boston and urban design.
Peter Kuttner.
Mike's not on.
Peter Kuttner, Cambridge 7 Associates, Architects in Boston.
And Andrea Lears. Can you hear?
Yes.
Didn't hear him. You want to say it again?
Is my mic
Yes.
up now?
That's
Yeah.
better.
I'll put it on my. Peter Kuttner, Cambridge 7 Associates.
Andrea Lears, Lears Wine Haffel Associates.
Nader Tehrani, principal of NADA and head of MIT.
Head of the architecture program at MIT. As you can tell, we are in an experimental phase and still finding our way with your help. And this is not the best venue I've ever imagined for an intimate architectural conversation. But we're here to talk about architecture for the next hour. The way we've set it up is we're going to try to do a broad screen look and touch all the bases. And when we had a preliminary discussion a week or two ago, we decided there were really 4 categories that our conversation might fall into. One was Boston and why are we all in Boston? One was how do you get started in architecture? How do you develop a practice in architecture? And what about education and how is that changing? So we're going to try to hit on those as we go along. And there are we're going to start with a couple of large questions that I'm going to address to the entire panel. I want everybody to try to answer this first question as a way of introducing yourselves and your personalities to the larger group here. And then we'll move into a mutual conversation among the 7 of us, and then we'll break for questions and comments from the audience. I won the coin toss, so I get to ask the first question. And I want to begin with Boston. What is so great about Boston? Why did you decide to locate your practice here? What are the pluses and minuses of being here? I'm remembering a time when I first worked here when Cambridge and Boston were capitals really of world design, and we had people here like Walter Gropius and Tack and Josep Lluís Sert and Ben Thompson and many others, and there was a kind of a sense that we were in a hotbed of kind of architecture. Can you all hear me? Can you all hear me?
Move that up. Yeah.
I don't know, they placed it here.
Whoa. Yeah. Just move it up a little bit on your time, maybe. Sorry.
How is this?
Yeah, we're here.
Can you turn it? Can you just turn the speakers on louder?
Yep. Go ahead.
It is now ideally placed.
Yeah.
Have we lost that kind of lead in the world of architecture? Is there any legacy of that era? Don't answer all those questions, but I just want to talk about Boston, why you're here, why you got here, where you think we're going. Bill, why don't you start?
I'm going to make it slightly more personal because I was working in, okay, how's that? Okay, totally fine. I'm sure others in the panel will talk about the Boston and the kind of global architecture, but let's talk about this city as a place to practice first. Boston's a very egalitarian, meritocratic city. It's a city full of immigrants. In fact, I figure all of us are immigrants in one way. David's from Chicago, Peter's from Michigan, Andrea's from Western Mass, which is different from Boston.
Somewhere on the other side of the Connecticut River.
Nader's farther east than all of us, and I'm from California. And somehow we got to Boston. Many of us came here to go to school and realized it was perhaps a more interesting place to stay rather than go back to where we came from. And certainly all of us came to Boston probably in the 60s and 70s when Boston had come alive. There was no question that there was a sense that Boston had a real future. This obviously has a lot to do with the universities here, and it's all the universities, not just Harvard and MIT. but the whole range of universities in the city or the region. And so I would say there are several things about Boston that are very special. One is the leaders of the civic culture are like us as architects economically. A city full of college professors who make the same amount of money we do. A city that used to be full of journalists and publishers. A city full of civic activists. All of us are highly educated and not in the world of, let's say, finance. And so in terms of the civic culture, architects can play a central role in the civic culture, whereas in many other cities, I think architects are often on the kind of fringe of the leadership, the power structure of a city. I think we all have access to it. And then the second is what I was starting to say about meritocracy and egalitarian. This city rewards the immigrants. It rewards people who work hard and come in with new ideas. And then the third is a kind of intellectual place of Boston now, and that is this whole question of, we're going to talk about it, I'm sure, during the hour, of architecture of place versus architecture of object. We are living in a city of ensemble, of buildings that have to get along with other buildings, that work together with other buildings. And the question is, can we as architects in Boston take a leadership role in disseminating possibilities for dealing with that around the country? And this is not, or around the world, and this is not just about contextualism, it's about all of us at this table are certainly modernist architects, and yet we're coping with this question of the sense of place and the importance of place. And this is increasingly important in the global economy because, of course, globalization breaks down the sense of place, as we can see in the architecture of Beijing or Abu Dhabi or wherever. And I think it's an opportunity for Boston to take a leadership role in that.
Great.
Thank you. David, you want to try that one?
Well, let's first see if my mic
Yeah.
works. Can
Looks-
everybody hear me, or do I have to hold it in my hand?
It's pretty good.
No?
Yep.
All right. I'll do the hand thing. Does that work better?
Yeah.
Okay, here we are. I actually hadn't planned to stay here. I had been working in Philadelphia with David Crane, who was one of the first persons to actually do urban design. In fact, he had coined the phrase along with Kevin Lynch and a number of others. And I had trained initially at the University of Illinois in Champaign in architecture, and was working in a little office down there, doing church details and housing and stuff in the middle of Ohio and places like that. While at the same time, in the mid-'60s, or mid to late '60s, and the city started blowing up. Chicago, Austin, Harlem, everywhere. And so there I was trying to figure out, was there some kind of way I could combine my architectural training with my concerns about what was happening in our cities. And David Crane had put a little card, an index card. There were a number of other architects who had left their cards for graduating students that might want to come to different places. So I ended up in Philadelphia working for David and working in Brooklyn and Bedford-Stuyvesant and North Philadelphia, a couple other neighborhoods like that, where I was able to combine some architectural training with sort of a nascent interest in planning and so forth. Of course, growing up in Chicago with all the vestiges of the Columbian Exposition, City Beautiful movement, all the wonderful WPA work, I had a strong feeling for what the public sector could be about. But at any rate, so I was working with David and had a chance to come to the GSD to go to graduate school. And so I came up the summer before, kind of looking for something to do, because I had a young family and I needed to work before going into school. And I met Donald Stull. And Don was one of the few African-American architects practicing with a thriving practice in the country. And so we sort of joined forces, and I kind of brought an urban design component to the firm. And then we got involved with the Southwest Quarter project and on and on. So I ended up sort of staying. It's kind of a cool place. I was close enough to New York. I could go hear some music from time to time. And Boston had a thriving music scene the time as well.
That's right.
And it was just a good time. It was the late 60s, early 70s, and the truth is the 60s really happened in the 70s.
Peter.
Thank you. It's interesting you mentioned David Crane, a name that I think has been forgotten, I think, but was a tremendously influential planner in those days. And in the last years of his life, he and I taught the thesis program together at the University of South Florida, of all strange things. But what we're beginning to hear here, I think, is that people come from very different backgrounds and very different sets of ambitions. Peter Kuttner, do you want to try? And by the way, did you hear me when I said all those? Okay, so we're going to have to do this thing. I'll take it out next time.
Mine's out and poised. I hope it works.
Yeah.
I'm a Midwestern boy, and so I spent most of growing up born in Indiana and then moved to Chicago and Illinois area and then to Michigan. And so I had a very different idea of what an urban environment was, what a suburb was, and grew up in a classic Midwestern suburb. I did spend then some significant years, my father was with General Electric, and we moved to Istanbul, Turkey. So I went to high school in Turkey, and I don't know how many people had the experience, and we'll probably talk about mentors a little bit more later, but I had an art teacher who thought architecture might be an interesting area for me to go into, and so took me to Hagia Sophia and to Topkapi, and those are pretty formidable experiences. So when I came back and went to school at Michigan, suddenly the difference between a community with history and tradition and a long line of architectural tradition hit home more. So when I started looking around for where to live and where to practice, that idea of layers of history, layers of architecture, and a city that was rich in that regard suddenly loomed more important. I also graduated in
Peter, hold it up tighter.
I also graduated in
That's better.
75, which was the energy crisis, and the equivalent of the stimulus program in that era seemed to be mass transit. So as I traveled around the country looking for work, there was MARTA projects in Atlanta, BART projects, there was the Washington, D.C. subway system, and then I came to Boston, and David was the first person who interviewed me for the Orange Line extension. And if he'd given me a job, we probably wouldn't both be on the panel today. So then I discovered Cambridge 7 and the Red Line extension. So I enjoyed the fact that I was suddenly working on a public project. I enjoyed the fact that I was working on a project that was layered throughout the city. And the Red Line extension, we did Porter Square, and I met Jane Weinzappel, Andrea's partner, because she was doing the Alewife station. So we worked together. So several offices worked together. So it was a kind of an amazing thing for me to understand the collegiality of architects who weren't bitter combatants with each other, of an organization like the BSA that brought people together. And even actually I had heard in the Midwest that contractors and architects didn't fight as much in Boston. And so it was a kind of an interesting way to see all of this layer together. The other point that was intriguing to me is, and I think it's true of most of us besides being immigrants to Boston, is most of our clients are nonprofits. And this is a community whose backbone is nonprofits, not really the development world. And so colleges, museums, all these other organizations, hospitals, the medical profession, they're here to stay. They live here. They have a stake in it. They don't suddenly move up and are sold to an organization in Chicago or Florida or something like that. So it's great in the same kind of way that we bond with our clients that Bill was talking about. These nonprofits are the community, and we are part of that by working with them.
Yeah, I'd just like to add that, one of the things I like that I'm hearing, and I too am an immigrant, came to Boston to go to journalism school, as I think many people of this generation at least came up here and stayed. I like what I'm hearing about this. People can hear me okay, yes? No? Gosh. I like what I'm hearing about the civic engagement of the members of the panel that have spoken so far, that there is something about Boston, I think perhaps because of the domination of the nonprofits, the hospitals, the universities, the meds and eds as they're called in our economy, but there is something about Boston that encourages civic engagement across professions in a way that might not be true in some of the other big cities. So I'm just turning it over to Andrea to see if you wanted to add on that.
Yeah, that's certainly. Can you all hear me? I'm going to hold it out here
Yeah.
too. I guess that's the best way. I may be the most local among the group here, although I'll have to say that my father would be horrified to hear me say that. He was a New Yorker, and though I grew up in Massachusetts, in Springfield, we always went to New York. New York was the only city there was. I never came to Boston my whole youth, came only to college in the area, and carried his prejudice for a very long time that Boston was hardly a city at all. But I went to I studied architecture at the University of Pennsylvania at a tremendously inspiring time. It was the latest years of Louis Kahn, and he gathered around him Robert Venturi, and Ian McHarg was there, and Aldo Jergola, and it was just an enormously exciting time. And I did think about staying there because of that. But Boston drew me back for the very reasons that many have said here. And it's a city of ideas.
Your mic.
Pick it up.
To
Pick your
higher?
mic up. Yeah,
Better
closer to
here?
your mouth.
Better here?
Closer to your mouth.
Better? Worse?
I think
Doesn't
her
seem to be
mic-
working.
oh. Tap it. Yeah. that's all.
Better?
Yeah.
That's better.
Sorry. I came here because in the end I understood that Boston was different from New York, and even my father did finally agree with me that it had something good. It's a city of ideas and inventions. There is just no more powerful combination of presidents, writers, scholars, inventors that have come out of the Boston-Cambridge complex, I think anywhere in the country. And it has created a kind of environment in which the care of quality of what we do is very, very high. I would say that maybe more than most places that I'm aware of, that is what characterizes a population of people who think about things, who care about their city, who are well educated, who are worldly, and that makes for the care of great environments and great architecture. So I think that is probably a really powerful quality of Boston. Boston has produced consistently over a long period of time a very high quality group of architects and designers. Lots of gold medal and AIA firm award winners, very disproportionate to the population here around the country. I like to think that we've almost taken the leadership and invented the partnership or the collaborative practice. I think more than many cities, that really characterizes our work. I too came here and was drawn here at a time of a lot of excitement, the 60s, 70s. A lot was going on here. It did feel like a more exciting place than anywhere. But as is always true, centers of gravity moved on. I think after that, New York became a very exciting place where new ideas came. Then it was LA, and then it was Barcelona, and then it was Netherlands, and then it was Tokyo and Beijing. I don't think we need to regret the moving quality of places where architectural ideas come from. I think that that's normal. We've always been receptive to great invention and great architecture here. We have some wonderful things from the 50s onward in the modern era and certainly before that. So is Boston conservative now? Have we lost our edge now? I think we have been traumatized by the era of urban renewal. I think we're seeing a retrenchment and a gradually, I hope, coming out of that reaction. But I do think that there's the soil for a tremendous degree of invention and excitement here.
Well, I was going to ask for a little bit more to develop a little bit more of that theme from Nadir Tarani from MIT. We heard earlier about how this is a city of ensemble for our buildings. So this is kind of an aesthetic question, really, about Boston and about its reputation for being kind of a provincial town. Architecturally, we were traumatized, as you say, by the brutalist movement and Boston City Hall, and people have sort of lost a sense of confidence about the ability to build, strong design. So is that true even? This reputation that Boston has as being kind of all about brick and, classic architecture and not comfortable with new ideas architecturally. Is it even true? And then also, and this I'd like to sort of, come back down the row to talk about this very neighborhood where we are now, Boston's newest neighborhood, the waterfront. What do we think about the aesthetics of this neighborhood so far? What does it say about us today? Does regionalism or regional identity for Boston even really matter in a global world? Want to take all that?
I can try.
Yeah, thank you.
Boston has inherited some stigmas, certainly. But before we inherited that, there was Sert, who built more in Boston than he did in Barcelona. We had Saarinen, we had Alto, we have Le Corbusier. We have a range of buildings that are quite progressive, quite experimental, and really the entire globe comes here to see them, to study them, and to analyze them. So we're quite lucky, actually, to be among such buildings. Obviously, a lot of us in this room are the product of discourses inherited in the 80s that have to do with maybe a productive reevaluation of the role of history in negotiating the relationship between architecture and the city. At the same time, some of the movements of preservation, let's say, could be argued to have trivialized the fundamental differences between the 17th, 18th, 19th, and 20th century, which is composed of significant departures from each other. And so I guess I would ask the counter question to that. A lot of the time it's not a question of what the aesthetic of architecture is, but how it works. Architecture is the result of systems. Architecture is the result of organizations, of invented typologies, and its image is very much the result of an overall makeup, if you like. On the other hand, there's nothing wrong with brick. It's how you use the brick. So the question is not in the identity of the brick. It's the way in which brick can be rethought, to be innovative, and to transcend its historical terms. We could say that same thing about stone and glass and metal and so forth. So I think that much of that discourse is past us by now. Everybody understands that the terms of urgency today, whether they're dealing with urban growth, with sustainability, the relationship between architecture and technology, have displaced reductive discourses about imagery or aesthetics, and are now cultivating a slightly larger sphere of discussion around the question of inserting new buildings in the city.
Well done. What about our waterfront here? What do we think of it so far? That's controversial question, perhaps.
I'm still waiting for somebody to say, I don't know how I got stuck in this backwater. I should have moved to Dallas.
I just came back from Dallas. I was actually there for a conference just last week, and there's some amazing building going on there because there's a lot of money in Dallas, and people are not shy as they are in Boston or New England, I think, of asking to put their names on buildings if they give a lot of money. There was a T-Bone Pickens YMCA right on the corner of where my hotel was, for example.
I'm not surprised.
And so a lot of things get built there because people have money and are willing to slap their names on the buildings. So.
I'd like to hear the comment on this neighborhood too, but I'd also like to throw in another question, which Andrea's talk made me think of. You talked about how the sort of searchlight of activity moved from one city to another city over time. But you yourself are on airplanes every time I see you. You have just got off an airplane. Are we losing the sense of an individual place because of the fact that everybody is working everywhere? Or do you find there are advantages to being in Boston for a Boston architect and working so broadly around the world? You might add to that, although I'm maybe talking in place of you, your own experience knowing so much and having spent so much time in Japan and in France. Has that enriched your design? Is that something that people should think of as a useful kind of career move?
Let me answer the last first, because it was really one of the things that I was going to say when we think about the advice we give to young people. What's important about what we do? How do we prepare for it? One of the great things I believe in deeply is looking and learning. There's a word in Japanese for it. It's called kengaku, which means study, tour, and learn, kind of, all in one word. But I always found for myself, and I do urge others, that the close observation, the experience of a place is enormously enriching for what we do. It does not mean that we do the same thing everywhere we go. It means that we come to understand our own culture by reflection with others. Certainly Nadir can speak with deep knowledge of this kind of perspective. But I think through my own long time spent in Japan, and more recently, in recent years in France, I think we understand who we are better by seeing other places. And I deeply believe that regionalism is alive and well. It is true that we see a lot of work that kind of looks the same from one place to the next, but in fact, it can't possibly be. It can't be. The very facts on the ground are different from place to place. Climate is different. Building systems are different. Societies are different. And yes, it's possible to import a kind of architecture here, there, and everywhere. But in fact, I believe deeply that that we must know and understand a place. So I certainly don't expect to do the same thing in another place as I do here. But by the same token, seeing other places and understanding them, there can be elements of inspiration that are enormously important. I remember at one point I made my first trip to India. I was incredibly impressed with some of the Mughal architecture in Fatehpur Sikri. And it was just at the time we were working on one of our early courthouses, and there were so many residences, this kind of sense of solidity and seriousness and kind of rootedness that was very meaningful. So I do think, yes, we're moving around all the time, we're looking, but I think there's no better way to learn than to look carefully at places, at buildings, at landscapes, at cities. All of that, for me, has always enriched enormously how I work.
Is someone going to pick? Whoop! Forgetting this.
This question is getting fatter and fatter.
Yeah.
But working backwards, I think the Architecture Boston in an old brick issue once addressed the fact that we as architects have a kind of a NIMBY phenomenon ourselves, is as we leave Boston, we experiment a bit more with the architecture and the expression, and that as you look at the portfolio of many Boston architects, some of their buildings that are more iconic or more self-referential are in other places, and when we move home, we're a little bit more mannered and a little bit more well-behaved. And it is because possibly it's our own home. But I also think people around the globe come and frequently talk to us about what they want in terms of, and we want to give clients what they want, and they are looking for something more expressive, and we're not having our clients in Boston actually demand that level of iconic architecture. They have other reasons to fit in, or they already have an entire campus of medical buildings or hospital buildings or a museum. So we're not seeing the demand as much. Sometimes it's categorized as, we're willing to experiment in other people's backyards, but I think it's more nuanced than that. And as far as the waterfront component of that same question, is what's been inspiring to me and disappointing, as we fought to keep the height limits down and the density in the waterfront to a certain extent through the BSA and with the BRA. The end result is everybody seems to be building exactly to the zoning envelope. So there's a kind of sameness that's happening from a massing point of view that is unfortunate when the financial formula exactly fills that.
That's what happened in D.C.
Yeah. And so I find that a little unfortunate. What I find is terrific, and I credit both the Greenway and the Harbor Walk, is that buildings that first appeared down in the waterfront on both sides, and in our case it was the aquarium 40 years ago and then the Children's Museum 20 years ago. Those were buildings that were intended to be investments as catalysts for other development to come, and as such they didn't have much responsibility to the surroundings or to the waterfront other than just being there. So the children's museums windows were boarded up, the aquarium turned its back to the waterfront. Now, 40 and 20 years later, because the Harbor Walk is such an important element, those two institutions are turning around and opening up their doors to the water side. The ICA came in and was really the first one to have, not literally its front door on the water side, but its apparent front door on the water side. So that's a huge new way to embrace the water. Once upon a time, any waterfront pictures of Boston were Back Bay. We're looking across the Charles. Right. Now, people celebrate views of Boston that really are Boston Harbor.
I wanted to pick up on the waterfront thing, too. Having been here for several years now, although we're about to leave us here, right? It's getting a little pricey down here now. But I'm reminded of something. Someone asked Mao Zedong what he thought of the French Revolution, and he said it was still too early to tell. And to some extent, I think we tend to be judgmental and really bring neighborhoods evolve over time. To be honest with you, and maybe it's part of what you were just saying, Peter, the attention to the same basic massing, I don't think we've hit it yet. I think the buildings are sort of okay, but I don't see any real wild buildings yet, which for me is a little bit unfortunate. And I'm sure we'll get there, but because I think so many of us really do respect the existing fabric of the city, and therefore try to play nice in a good way in these other neighborhoods. The waterfront was sort of a tabula rasa, and it seems to me here's where we really could be kind of feeling our oats a little more and doing some other things. I think it's got to happen both in terms of the buildings, but I think it also has to happen in terms of the urban design components of it. But it's early, and I think eventually this has the potential to be quite an exciting place. But we got to have a few that sort of break the rules a little bit.
Something has to happen. I think the South Boston waterfront today looks like a suburban office park. It looks as if the traffic planners came first and everybody else fit in whatever spaces were left over. Things are too far from each other. There is no good pedestrian experience except for one short walk along the restaurants there.
Other than that, Mrs. Lincoln, how'd you like to play?
You quoted someone, I was going to quote Nehru back to you. I think it was Nehru. He was asked, what is your opinion of Western civilization? And he said, I think it would be an excellent idea.
You know, somewhere in this hall today, there is a model of the micro unit that Mayor Menino has proposed to be built as a way to bring young professionals who can't afford high rents down to this area. I mean, it seems to me that, you know, a neighborhood is of buildings, sure, but of course it's also of people. And what feels like it's missing to me down here are people who are not conventioneers, you know, but people who live here and work here. You know, where's the hardware store? Where is the grocery store? You know, things that will make this really into a living neighborhood. Bill, do you want to answer any one of those questions that came along?
Well, I'll just simply say I agree with both of you. I mean, you know, it's interesting, this question of the conventioneers and the convention center. I mean, in fact, this is a pretty bold building.
Yeah, this
we're
building,
in,
yes.
And
This is one of the better convention centers, in my opinion.
in the country.
Yes.
Yep, without question. Just in terms of aesthetics, also actually in terms of ease of getting around the inside.
And the volume and the light and the sort of generosity about it.
Acoustics are not
The acoustics need something to be desired, yeah.
But it's interesting, it came here ahead of what we're seeing being built now. It's like a generation ahead of that.
Yes.
Now we've got a neighborhood, you know, the ICA and full of kind of entertainment activities, and the question is, can a real city be built behind it? And that's where you get back to Robert's complaint, is have we built an infrastructure that is going to prevent that from happening?
Exactly.
Can I?
Peter?
Yeah, Peter.
I just wanted to pipe in on more because you mentioned how the building works beyond its aesthetics, and I do think that, you know, there's the parallel side of architecture besides the formalism, or is there a Boston school, that people are learning or people are innovating in Boston. And I think that while they might be not visiting the Carpenter Center, an enormous number of people continue to come to Boston to see innovations in the way the business school creates a classroom, in the way the Children's Museum innovates with hands-on activities, in medical changes, in work-living situations in Fort Point Channel. So we continue to innovate in an innovation zone and in good new buildings that work well. And so while we may not have the sort of formal acknowledgement of a kind of stylistic renaissance here, we continue to innovate in the way architecture works, the way people use it, and the way the experience that you have, and have been doing that consistently, I think, for many years.
I'd like to move the discussion a little bit to another track and talk about yourselves as individuals, how you got started, why did you become an architect? Let's, we have some younger people here that would like to hear who were your mentors, who were your models and influences, books, movies. What was your first project done in your own hand? Where was the first place you worked? How do you mentor in your own office? And what advice would you give a young architect starting out with her own firm? Anybody want to sort of dig into any of those? Nader, you're the educator here at the moment. Why don't you talk about it? But why did you become an architect?
It's hard to say. Part of it is biographical. I mean, I had two older cousins in the arts, and so I maybe naturally followed in their footsteps. Maybe also I never had a home because I grew up in London, in Pakistan, in South Africa, and in Iran. So I suppose I looked at architecture as somehow forming a foundation. I'm not sure. Maybe that's more of a psychoanalysis. But landing here in the U.S. After or just before the revolution in Iran, essentially I landed in the Rhode Island School of Design, and that effectively changed everything in terms of my education and my ambitions. I have a very classic thread of sequence of events after that. Under Rodolfo Machado, RISD was completely transformed in those years. Subsequent to that, I continued my education at the Architectural Association and then at Harvard when Betty was there, Monet was there, Max Gordon was there. So there's in a way my constellation, my childhood, if you like, my growth is all defined by the great pedagogies and the great debates and discourses that revolve around buildings and architecture. And so much of it, I realized, has to do with history and with debate, not just the technical skilling that is required of a professional architect. And my own mentorship started in this city in my first internship for who were then very young architects, Schwartz and Silver in 1982 or 83. And I launched my own practice here primarily as a dissatisfaction with what I understood to be the tenets of professionalism and the standards of the building industry that I found around us.
What was wrong with those standards and tenets?
Well, in an advanced society with advanced industries, you tend to have development of guarantees, warranties around products and expectations of performance that essentially help to kill innovation, because you cannot experiment around those products, and anything that goes to the market has to be tested in accordance with comparable products. So all of the kinds of innovative things that you have happening around the world right now are happening more in China, more in Iran, more in Chile, more in many other places that have laterally flexible ability to build things that we are not allowed to build anymore here.
Very interesting.
And I remain committed to that as a form of I mean, if there's anything I would mentor in my office right now is how do you get around all of the conventional protocols which consist of anything from the framing of the building to the skinning of the building to the structuring of building. I mean, you name it.
Very interesting. Someone else want to try this? Why did you become an architect? Who were your mentors and how do you mentor others?
What advice would you give to young architects today?
Andrea, you look like you're eager to answer.
If I can get
Because you're fussing with your microphone.
Can you all hear me?
Bill, you want-
Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
I talked a little bit about what my education and early inspiration was. But when I came back to Boston, I worked with Earl Flansburgh and Associates, who had been something of a mentor to me as an undergraduate. I was not so sure that I wanted to be an architect. I had been interested in painting, and when I was at Wellesley College, I sort of drifted off into art history and other things, but I was always interested in the arts and thought probably I would have a creative life somehow. At the end of studying art history, I thought, no, I'd really rather do it than study it, and let's see what architecture might be like. I had no exposure really to anything like that, and so I really went into it with eyes wide open, and maybe I'll like it, maybe I won't. And at the end of a year or two of school, I found that I was really drawn in. So when I came back to Boston, Earl Flansburgh had just then, I think, left TAC, and he was starting a small office, 7 people. Jane and I were the 5th and 6th or 7th people that he hired. He had about 50% of all the women architects in Boston at the time. And worked there for 3 years. We did a lot of, that was an introduction to a lot of public schools and the importance of doing work in the community. And at the end of that time, I think I was just really very eager to do it myself. I think that was the desire to test my own ideas, try out things on my own, led me to think about beginning practice on my own. And it was a big leap. It was, I think Jane and I had no idea how hard it would be. That helped, actually. And I worked for a while with Hugh Browning briefly. Then I worked on my own in a small practice for about 5 years, and then Jane and I joined together. So which was in 1982, and the rest is history. But I will have to say, and I often tell people who say, gee, do I want to start a practice? What does it take? It really takes the passion to do it, and that is the most important ingredient. If you did all the calculation of whether it was worth it and so forth, it would never come out worth it in that sense. You really need to have that kind of desire. And that's the kind of guidance I've passed on to others. It was clear, I think, from the beginning that Jane and I would be doing work for ourselves and our profession as well as for women in our profession. We always were aware of that. And I think among the many students and people I've mentored over the years, I think I've had a special care for women to see that they were able to develop to their fullest, and I'm proud to say that some of my best projects, there's Karen Moore here sitting in the audience right here. Marion Weiss was one of my students, Tiffany Lynn, who's now teaching down at Tulane, Carol Burns right here in the city. We're all students, and I'm just tremendously proud of them as well.
One of the things that many of you here represent is kind of a little bit of an endangered species, which you all represent kind of mid-sized firms, which, as I understand it, are sort of falling out of the middle of the profession in some ways. So what about that? I mean, is that, and I still want to hear the answers about advice to young architects and education of architects and so on. We have about 10 minutes more, and then we'll maybe open it to the audience.
Well, let me try back to Robert's question, really. And like probably everyone in the room, as a kid, an 8-year-old, a 10-year-old, I was constantly drawing buildings, creating urban plans, all of this, until at age 15, my father sat me down one day and told me all the reasons why I should not be an architect. He never mentioned the problem of money. He just fashioned it very cleverly into what he thought I was good at and what I might not be good at. And so I went off to college, liberal arts major, and as many of you know, I went on to law school, where, by the way, I took courses at Carpenter Center in Corbusier's building for credit at Harvard Law School, which I'm kind of proud of now. But it's, and then the next important thing, which is important in this context, is I went to work for the University of Massachusetts, the Office of the President, and he was a fantastic mentor, and after 18 months sent me out to the Boston campus to be assistant chancellor of that campus in charge of community affairs and physical planning, about which I knew nothing, because this is before architecture school. But it was a kind of sink or swim experience that was incredibly powerful. So then I go to architecture school and then went to New York and worked for Davis Brody, which had a wonderful housing practice in those days. And I get to this because then, like Andrea, I finally decided I wanted to start my own practice. In New York, I was no different from any 27-year-old just out of Columbia. In Boston, I had a bunch of contacts from my UMass days and decided to go out on my own, and it is harder work than I even imagined. Likewise, not to scare you away from doing it, but you have to be dedicated to it. The interesting thing about getting clients is Yale College produced no clients. Literally, in the first 6 or 10 years, not a single connection from Yale College produced any work in Boston. Harvard Law School, no clients. Lawyers believe you have to have done it for 40 years before you can do anything. UMass, the commuter institution devoted to low-income kids, produced lots of clients for me in the sense of other people involved in public higher education, city affairs, other universities who I came in contact with in that job, all started hiring us. And I say that because it's not about family connections. To me, Yale and Harvard Law School were like family connections. We're all immigrants, so we had no families here. It was a place where they got to know you in a professional position, and the people you got to know in that professional position decided to hire you, even though now you're an architect, not something else. The other thing I would say to young people is housing is an incredibly wonderful way to break into larger scale work. That it's easy for our big break was being introduced to the head of the Bricklayers Union in Boston. He hired us to do affordable housing. Mayor Flynn loved the small project we did in South Boston and hired us to do something in Charlestown Navy Yard and over in Mission Hill. And we take the same unit and replicate it 75 times or 165, and obviously there were more than one unit types, but it's something that a small firm could really grab a hold of and start to develop a reputation for buildings that had some impact on their civic space, that were bigger than an individual house. And I always wanted to do that public work. At that time, I should say, like Andrea, I think in those days of Alan Joslin, who worked for me for 15 years and was a very important colleague in that development. Then, of course, the breaks start coming, and I smile because Ozawa Hall was another important break, and we were the young firm on the list of otherwise well-known large firms for that as finalists. And to think that the trustees of the symphony orchestra came and looked at Charlestown Navy Yard to decide whether we could build a concert hall is a kind of wonderful thing. And so I just say that housing, any young person in this room should get their eye on housing because it's a great way to break into the profession.
And Tracy Kidder wrote a book about one of your first projects.
Right.
Say just very briefly how that happened, because that's
well,
part of...
I thought you were going to tease me and say, but you didn't mention Tracy Kidder. I don't recommend getting a book written about you and your first project, but let's remember that was a book about building a house, and if I wanted to build a practice about houses, that would have been a good threshold to start, but I really wanted to do public architecture at a much bigger scale, a city scale. And so Tracy knew the builders of the house. He knew them very well. Tracy was an unbelievably ethical writer because the great story would have been, here these salt-of-the-earth builders were building this house and this overeducated, inexperienced architect was trying to tell them what to do. That would have been a great story, but he didn't choose to do that. And I guess the nice thing of that is we did win a Boston Exports Award from the BSA before the book came out, I'm proud to say. And Tracy made a lot of money on the book and did hire us to build a house for him in Maine. But it's not, I would not suggest this as the way to do it, and I could have been creamed by him had he been a different kind of writer.
All these stories are very interesting in the way one thing leads to another, how coincidence plays a part. I have another friend, an architect, many of whose clients have been all members of the Porcellian Club at Harvard. And that was true of H.H. Richardson, too. All of his clients came from his kind of social friends and club-like friends. He belonged to an enormous number of clubs at Harvard. So there are just different ways of doing things.
But I think Boston, that's why I started about the egalitarian and meritocracy of Boston that I don't think that's the way to get work in the city anymore. I
actually-
honestly don't.
I think that's right.
And you do read about architects, Robert Venturi for one, who got a commission from their parents to build a house and parlayed that into something. I don't think that's, I don't, yes, if your father or mother wants to hire you to build a house, do it, because you get a chance to do something. But I don't think most of their best friends would hire you as an architect to do the first project. And I say that because Boston's a very different place. It's, again, the city of immigrants that I think plays a part in this.
Well, you know, you mentioned being introduced. Gosh, you mentioned being introduced to the Bricklayers Union. Can people hear this? You mentioned being introduced to the Bricklayers Union, and Boston also has a reputation for being a very political town. You know, the mayor is very interested in the buildings that are built here. He even, you know, intervenes to recommend certain flourishes on certain buildings. I'm just wondering what advice you might give any of you about that. You know, how important is it to have, you know, political contacts? You know, how important to be known and seen in those circles? David, anyone? Peter?
Yeah, is this on? Yeah. And I'm agreeing with Bill here. It has changed quite a bit, and I think part of it's the characteristics of a town of nonprofits. There's incredible pressure towards transparency. So knowing somebody or having a political connection, for the most part, gets you to the short list. It's just impossible to have somebody hand you a job behind the scenes anymore. And so quite frankly, you put in your qualifications, you put in your, and then you have your RFP, and then you have your interview. So it's egalitarian in that regard. I think one of the things that's unique about, and this is in reference to the mid-sized firm, which, you know, common wisdom right now is that we're going to have giant firms and tiny little boutique firms, and they're going to work for the giant firms. And the mid-sized firm is a little at risk. One of the unique things in Boston compared to the rest of the country is our mid-sized firms actually are becoming multi-generational. They're staying around much longer. They're transitioning to new leadership, whereas once an architect, you know, died with their hands firmly around the steering wheel, now there's reasons to continue those firms. And I think that puts the firms here in a stronger position. And they live here. They're, you know, these are the homes of most of the single office of most of the firms here. So that's sort of changed the way the mid-sized firm works. The unfortunate part of it is I think it's throttled the generation of new firms to a large extent. So getting started is a little harder here. You've got all the obstacles of technology you've got to buy, increased licensure problems, a lot of more regulation. And when you couple that together with the fact that the old firms aren't going away, it is a little harder to get a firm started. So the advice here is to work for more of those existing firms, and I suspect for slightly longer than maybe we did 20 years ago before you start off on your own.
I just want to say that when David finishes up, we might go to questions from the audience. Go ahead.
All right, well, I mean, just a couple of, just a couple of things. When we were anticipating what the crowd might be, there was talk of it being a lot of young people. Well, yeah, I don't want to upset anybody, but there aren't a lot of young people out there. And
They're young for architects.
well, yeah, that's true. Well, that's very true. And I'll be honest with you, the last few years have been very tough. Been very tough for my firm. Projects are harder to come by. The kinds of projects and things we used to do, you go to an interview, there might be 4 or 5 usual suspects. There are now 40 people at that interview. At times, there are large firms who are going real low just to keep the infrastructure together. There's not a lot happening in the public sector, the kind of scale of projects like the Southwest Corridor and Central Artery, which really allowed our firm to thrive. A lot of my clients are nonprofits, but people who rely on foundations and other kind of support, which they're not getting these days because of things. So, I mean, I'm being perfectly candid with you. It's been a very tough time, and a lot of the work we're doing is in other places. And in that case, we're sometimes collaborating with local firms, so I miss like getting out on the site. I see it from pictures and stuff like that, or we're doing planning work, that kind of thing. So I'm doing a lot of rethinking of it all. But the way I got started in all of this was really because of my father, who was an instrument maker for the U.S. Geological Survey, but he actually was very interested in architecture. And as you mentioned, I grew up in Chicago, and he took me around to IIT, I'm sorry, and to 880, the Mises buildings, and then Chicago itself was a laboratory, again, with all the vestiges of the great City Beautiful movement, and then one of the most wonderful places in all of the world, and this never fails, and to talk about what architecture can be about. But if I talk with anybody that grew up probably within 100 miles of Chicago, and I mention the Museum of Science and Industry, they just sigh, because it was such a powerful place, and a world that was really there. In terms of mentors, obviously David Crane was a mentor. He helped a lot. But as an African American, I didn't have a lot of mentors. And our practice has been an interesting kind of practice that way, in that a lot of our clients are quite different. It has caused us to have to be very creative from time to time. And there's some things I wish I could do. But when you're going to work with clients who are church ladies, they want the norm. They don't want the quote-unquote kind of crazy stuff that you see in the magazines frequently. But for us, it's been kind of making it up as we go. There have been no real models for us. It's not. I don't have generations of others to look at. I surely respect the work of all of my colleagues here, and every once in a while I look at some work, not necessarily from them, but from others, and I say, how did you ever get a client to let you use that material? People would go ballistic if I tried that.
I think
Send them to Nadir.
Do you want to do this or should
Yeah, I think we'd like to move to questions from the audience. If we have, there are some people around here who have microphones. Yes? Somebody with the microphones want to raise their hands with the microphone so I can see where it is?
Please only speak into the microphone, and please identify
There are the
yourself.
microphones over here. So if you have a question, please raise your hand or stand up
Say who you are
so
and
the
ask the
microphone
question.
can find you. There's one over here, way over here. Here we go. Microphone being passed back. Nicely done.
The microphone works if it's close to my mouth.
Yes, very nice.
My name is Ann Lusk. I am a research scientist at the Harvard School of Public Health. My PhD is in architecture. I fully understand the meds and eds of Boston. I also want to compliment Boston because it's also a community of arcs. Meds, eds, and arcs. Therefore, I would ask all of you, and also specifically David, to look at how Boston can be more progressive than any other city in the world on creating streetscapes and buildings for physical activity as a routine part of the day. David, when you created the Orange Line, you created the Southwest Corridor that's really a Dutch bicycle cycle track because it's only for bicyclists beside a pedestrian corridor. In the Innovation District, we would love to have not just wide sidewalks because too many people walk slowly, but Dutch cycle tracks that are bicycle exclusive. We know Björk Engel's building had bicyclists going into the pavilion. There's also progressive bike parking inside buildings. So how can we put Boston ahead of others and fully incorporate physical activity in the buildings as well as the streetscapes?
Thank you.
Well, I do think that Boston's well on its way in a sense. I mean, Boston's DNA has always been as kind of a walking city. And to some extent, the further we get away from that, the less inviting it is as a place. It is nice to walk around and see all of the places where they actually have bicycles, the bicycles, including in Roxbury. I really appreciate the fact that it wasn't just limited to downtown or other areas, and apparently it's been a big success. I think all of us talk about the ensemble nature of Boston because I think we appreciate not only the buildings, but the context within which the buildings occur. I think we have to continue to push the BRA to be open and to the idea of a really lively streetscape and walkable environment, and not simply what the dollars are on the bottom line, but to make sure that the buildings do encourage that kind of life and activity and so forth. As the baby boomers all age, the more people can walk and get out, and many moving back into the cities, I think the idea of having a lively streetscape is going to be more and more important. And I think if Boston is to find its mojo again, get back, on the merry-go-round, it may be in how we deal with the unique qualities of our environment, the historical opportunities, the ability to create a new infrastructure on which to put excellent buildings.
Nicely put. Peter, you want to add something?
I just wanted to make one other point about fitness and well-being in architecture. And AIA New York has sort of taken the lead in this in terms of architecture that encourage movement, and recognize the odd little thing in our attempts to create accessible environments. The elevator has beaten out the stair to the point where so many buildings, the only stairs are fire stairs required by code tucked away. And so one of the delightful things is the return of the ceremonial stair, and a really good rationale to encourage clients and users to create spaces where elevators and ceremonial stairs in common provide opportunities to move through a building, and are terrific exercise as well.
Yeah. Did you have something to add, Nadir? You were nodding.
I don't have the expertise to respond. I agree with what everyone is saying. The only operative word I would say is infrastructure. That given the depleted funds that we have, and given the segregation of specializations, that this one goes to the traffic engineer and this one goes to the civil, it seems that the common ground is the idea that infrastructure could become the common platform around which to give identity to the city, which is something that I think has been lost in the last, let's say, 30, 40 years in the United States.
Yeah.
Nadir, I want to pick up on that, because when I was teaching at the GSD, and we were also working with some colleagues I see out there on the Central Artery Project in particular, I coined the phrase infrastructure. Because I wanted to get back to the idea of infrastructure as architecture as well. And some of the great models for me were the kinds of things like the grain elevators outside of Chicago, or some of the other grand pieces of work that weren't just about the lowest denominator, but actually were grand things. In fact, I often tell a story, I had a chance to say it to Elizabeth Warren, that they asked Alan Shepard when he was the first American astronaut to take off on a suborbital flight, and they asked him what was he thinking as he counted down. He said he couldn't shake the thought that the rocket was built by the lowest bidder.
Right.
And somehow we have to get back to where our infrastructure isn't always about the lowest bidder.
Yeah. Nicely put. Other questions from the audience? There's one here.
Why we're here, whether Boston hotbed or cutting edge design and so on. I'm surprised that one of the issues you folks didn't speak of is the permitting process in Boston, because as you all know, in Boston and our Guardian region in general, pretty much no project, and certainly no significant project, is built as a right like many other cities, and this really opens up a whole host of issues relative to process and people involved in it. I have to tell you that you are members of the City Design Commission. You've got community groups, BRA, you've got Civic Design Commission, and I argue that in general, Boston's architecture is better in its urban design aspects because of this, and at the same time that this lumps this
There's a great bunch of questions in there. Boston's reputation for social, civic activism, and community activism that gets in the way sometimes. Permitting, does it slow things down? Does it make it better? Go ahead.
Well, I turned to Andrea because we're both on the BCDC, and I'd almost ask you, Nandi, whether we're seen as something that's helpful to the process or not. You were nice to give us some credit for having an impact on urban design issues, but in terms of thinking about inventive architecture, are we a force that is helping that happen, or causing it to, our questions get in the way of that happening? I will, and I'd almost turn that question to anyone in this room, that I think, I won't get off on the BCDC too much, but it would be very helpful. We've got a really good group of people on this commission, and yet we get many projects which aren't particularly wonderful, and the question is, do you prohibit them from happening, or how do you intervene? And in fact, we don't have the ultimate power. We are advisory to the BRA and ultimately to the mayor, and that's a good thing, because you watch the Beacon Hill Architectural Commission or Back Bay Architectural Commission, which are legislatively enacted to be totally independent of the process, and they're the ones who are worrying about the shape of the wood mullions on the window and prohibiting anything from happening in those neighborhoods. That may be a good thing, but it's also inhibits innovation. And so the question to all of you is, in a sense, we like to think we're trying to represent architects in this city in terms of encouraging better and better architecture, and are we a force for that, for good or not? Obviously, we all understand that the BRA and other agencies have much more impact on questions of zoning and the like, even questions of the Seaport District, which includes Massport. But I throw that out, and I realize I'm not going to generate a discussion here, but we are sitting there trying to represent the profession in a process. We're a spot in the zoning code that Stephen Coyle set up, and it would be a very interesting question whether we are a force for change or a force for improvement or not. And I know that doesn't answer your question, but...
Let me just pick up a little bit there, because Bill, who has been, I think, the longest standing member on the Boston
So
Civic
blame me
Design,
for everything.
just about the longest. I'm a newer member, but I think, first of all, I'm struck by the fact that not every city has a commission like this, right? So we start out by having some group, advisory though it is, not regulatory, that cares a lot. And I often find myself saying, when we're reviewing projects, this is the best free advice you're ever going to get. And because we have no horse in the race, we just want it to be better for the city. So the fact that the commission exists, that's its bent, let's say, to take each and every project and to try to help it be the best it can. Very often, in opposition to prior direction that project has received, either from a neighborhood group or from the BRA itself sometimes. So we are, the benefit, I suppose, is that we're truly independent. The downside is we don't have to be listened to either. So I think the fact that it exists is good. I think that we do have, on occasion, opportunity to spur and to encourage greater freedom, greater experiment, and we do that. Again, it's advisory. I think that there was the earlier question about being active in the streets. I think one of the things the group does well is to care a lot about life on the street, the pedestrian life, let's say the non-vehicular life on the street. So activities, and we do give a great deal of attention to that. So I do think it's, in general, a force for the good. Sometimes it feels as though there's not too much that can be done to help. There are projects that come before us that we hope to encourage in a better direction. Then there are some fabulous projects that you just want to say, fly with it, go ahead. So I guess that our participatory environment here in Boston has that as one positive feature.
Andrea, let me just make one comment about the BCDC, which maybe we're aware of, maybe not aware of, but you're a great asset to architects with their clients. Because a lot of times you'll want to do something, you can't get the client to go there, but when we get in front of you, oftentimes you're just the extra little help we need to get the client to think differently about the project. So I know that's one service you guys really perform.
Peter wanted to say something.
I was going to ever so slightly criticize that, in spite of the fact we might have to appear before you with a building one of these days, as I look back to a time before the BCDC, when we at the BSA were wishing the mayor or the BRA would actually just give us a call and ask us what we think, the mode in place at the time was a very robust urban design committee that would form task groups attached, literally attached like a
Committee of the BSA.
a committee of the BSA that would like a rat biting your ankle, following those projects, and had the ability to make changes, and literally, showed up at every review meeting, and those small task forces would come back and report to the urban design. And it was the bigger projects. It was the Copley Square. We did it with the waterfront and things like that, and it was pretty vibrant. At the same time, we were asking for something like the BCDC that was a more formalized thing that you would regularly come to it. So I think one of the unintended impacts of it was it became another just step in the chain. And sometimes people would say, did you have I don't want to give you our approval until you get their approval, or vice versa. And the Urban Design Committee, unfortunately, then had to step back a little because our voices were already the 5 or however many people sit at the table. So we shouldn't then countermand what they said. We shouldn't continue to bite at their heels. And so it became a little more of a discussion group about urban design. And so I think it would be healthy for the environment here if both things were happening at once.
Well, it actually would be really interesting if you tried to resuscitate that, and if one of those members of that committee came to every BCDC meeting. I mean, it doesn't need to be the same person at each meeting, but because the public is entitled to speak, and we sometimes need that support.